So this is actually my fourth time attending this conference, but first time presenting. So I look forward to any comment that you may have. And I want to say hi to anyone if you're watching this live streaming or recording. And today I'm presenting my working paper, Digging Up the Value Chain, Mineral Export Restrictions and Industrial Upgrading. So it's about natural resources, but it's more about development and industry policy. So I start with a simple observation that in the global trading system right now, minerals are no longer simply for sale. So this is not an area that you have the money that you granted your access to every kind of minerals. Usually, like foreign borrowers face different kinds of barriers set by local governments, saying that they want them to use the minerals domestically. Right? So these resource-rich developing countries, they are increasing imposing export restrictions on raw minerals. So here I'm highlighting export restrictions because there are different kinds of them, okay? In my paper, I focus on 5 different kinds of export restrictions, which are export bans, quotas, licensing requirements, simple tariffs, or other non-tariff barriers. And why these countries are doing this? Because they are using this kind of export restrictions as industrial policy tools. They want to promote their downstream processing, capture greater value added, and reduce their dependence on the commodity revenues, which are very volatile depending on the international prices of these minerals. Okay. So I have some news articles that shows some examples of such policies. As you can see, this is probably the most important export restrictions in the past 10 years, which is the Indonesia's export ban on nickel, okay? So if you know this context here, Indonesia have around 40% of nickel reserves around the world, and they're trying to use this policy to attract FDI, mostly from Chinese companies, into Indonesia for nickel processing. And you also see India have the same policy. Uganda and Congo in Africa have the same policy. So we will go back to the Ugandan case. But as you can see, these governments are trying to banning the raw mineral exports to improve their domestic capacity of producing downstream goods. Okay, for the Ugandan case, here I'm quoting the Ugandan President Museveni. He said that when you export the minerals from Uganda, they are exporting away their job opportunities. Okay, so these politicians are very strongly committed to such measures, and he said that Uganda will no longer export raw minerals, materials and minerals to the West. Okay, and of course, the government has an industrialization agenda, right? As I said, you're exporting away your jobs and opportunities, but the governments really want these companies to process this good locally so that they could, enhance their domestic value added. Okay, so this is the policy, stance of these governments. However, the effectiveness of such policies is still poorly understood. Okay, so we observe a lot of such policies, but we still don't understand to what extent they really, move the country up the value chain and enhance the downstream processing capacity. So this paper addressed this question. Basically, there are 3 related questions. The first one is that why do government increasingly favor mineral export restrictions over alternative policy instruments, right? Because there are different kinds of industry policies. There are subsidies, there are tax rates that you could target different sectors and firms. Why these governments are using more and more these mineral export restrictions as a more blunt industry policy? And theoretically, through what mechanisms can export restriction can promote downstream industrial development and enhance domestic welfare? So of course, industry development and welfare is a different thing, right? So you could expand the sector artificially by giving lots of subsidies, but you have to back this policy by the welfare implications, right? So the welfare implication could be negative. And finally, empirically, does such restrictions actually work? Do they actually expand downstream processing and foster broader industrial upgrading? So because I only have 20 minutes today, so I focus mostly on the third part, which is the empirical part, but I'll touch a little bit on the first 2 questions. All right, so as a preview, so why these governments are trying to use more and more industrial policies? Because they are facing fiscal constraint. Okay, so because the state capacity for this developing country are not that high, it makes them very hard to target what kind of firms, what kind of sectors to subsidy. Okay, so they are just using these export restriction policies as a administratively simple industrial policy, so that they won't need to identify which are the firms that should be subsidized. They could just subsidize the entire mineral sector and their downstream processing activities. And raw minerals, they are very natural targets of such industrial policies because they have really high upstreamness. Okay, if you are subsidizing an upstream sector, then by backward linkages, downstream sector could also benefit from cheaper input prices. And also, it have large RCA gaps. RCA is the reviewed comparative advantage. So why I'm saying this, because for these resource-rich developing countries, they typically export a lot of raw minerals, but they don't export the downstream processing goods. Okay, so this is the gap that these countries are trying to address using such kind of policies because they think there are some latent comparative advantage hidden in the minerals that they could utilize. Theory-wise, export restrictions act as an implicit subsidy to downstream manufacturing. Why? Because by creating a wedge between the domestic and international mineral prices, domestic firms could easily access cheaper mineral inputs, but foreign firms cannot, which act effectively as a subsidy to these domestic firms. Okay, and of course, this will trigger labor reallocation in the home country from the mining activities into the manufacturing activities and expanding the sectoral output. However, as I just said, sectoral expansion is not the same thing with welfare enhancement. Why? Because the welfare effects of such policy depends on the trade-off between two things. The first thing is you assume you have sectoral external return to scale in downstream sectors. Then if you are expanding the sectors, firms in the sector could have higher productivity, which gives you welfare gains. Okay, but in comparative advantage sense, your country is not that efficient producing downstream good. Okay, you have inferior technology compared to the developing countries. So you are basically producing some goods that could have been imported at a cheaper prices, which give you welfare losses. So the overall welfare consequences of such policies would depend on the trade-off between these two. And there's another term, which is if you are setting an export tax, then you still have tax revenue, but this is a pure fiscal term. But the first two terms are more important policy-wise. Okay, so empirics. So I document a global data set of export restrictions. So I have 125, I believe, export restrictions happened over the past 15 years. And first, this is a sanity check that these policies are binding because I observe like after these policies, the exports of the targeted minerals themselves significantly reduce by a large amount, or almost 40% in value and 60% in quantity. So these policies, they bite, okay? They do have the effects in restricting, in curbing the exports of minerals. In contrast, we do observe a downstream export stimulating effect, okay? So the downstream products the countries do export more downstream products by around 11% in value and 19% in quantities, okay? So if I stop here, you will say, okay, that's great. Export restriction do work. We could, expand our downstream processing capacity by just banning the exports of raw minerals. But I want to highlight some central caveats. The first one is the export gains are highly concentrated. Okay, most importantly, it's concentrated in the most immediate downstream stage, which mostly consists of the base metal products. Okay, and the effects dissipate rapidly along the value chain. And I will show you the effects to you that actually in the second processing stage, you basically observe nothing. Okay. And why is this the case? So I highlight two key barriers behind this pattern, which is technological complexity and input requirement. So when I decompose all the downstream products into terciles based on these two measures, you could see really these products with the lowest technology complexity and lowest input requirement that truly benefited from this policy. And for products with medium or high technology complexity or input requirements, you still see nothing. Okay, so these are the structural barriers that restrict the ability for these countries to benefit from such policies. All right. Okay, so I won't talk much about the literature, but mainly there are three large literatures: industrial policy, mineral export restrictions, and the resource curse literature. Okay, so my paper's contribution is to examine the effects of mineral export restriction as an unconventional industrial policy tool trying to promote downstream processing capacity. Okay, so these are some star effects. So in the current global trading system, lower income countries, they export more upstream goods. This is very intuitive because you can see, most of the African countries are on the upper left side of this graph. They have lower log GDP per capita, and they are exporting more of the upstream goods, which are the raw minerals or agricultural goods. Okay, So this is the current situation, but these governments don't want to do this forever, so they are imposing industrial policies, okay? But for lower income countries, they are using more export restrictions than others. Why? Because I highlighted earlier that these countries facing concerns of their state capacity and fiscal constraint, so that they could not use large-scale subsidies or tax breaks to target individual firms. And this is what I called an RCA gap, which I compared the review competitive advantage of raw minerals and downstream products between the targeted minerals and non-targeted minerals. So you can see the governments, they usually target the minerals when they are exporting more, right? They have a review competitive advantage in raw minerals. But if you look in the right panel, they don't have a review competitive advantage in downstream products, okay? So there's no structural difference between the restricted minerals downstream products and non-restricted minerals downstream products. And this is something that the government don't want to see. So they really wanted to use such policies to push the production capacity from the left panel to the right panel, from the raw minerals to downstream products. And in my full paper, which is available on my website, I have a general equilibrium model that model the welfare effects of the mineral export restrictions. But today I only touched a little bit on the general idea. So mineral export restrictions are inherently distortive, okay? It's a distortive industrial policy because it creates a wedge between domestic price and international price, and it implicitly subsidize downstream processing sectors. This could be welfare improving, but this can only be welfare improving if they can correct other domestic distortion. This is intuitive because you are introducing distortion into your domestic economy. Only if you are correcting something else, this policy could be welfare enhancing. So what kind of domestic distortion that come to my mind is that maybe in the downstream processing sector, you could have external economic scale, right? So this is very prevalent in manufacturing sectors by having a larger sectoral output. Individual firms also benefit more from the spillover, knowledge spillover, or whatever externality. In this case, the welfare consequences will depend on this trade-off that I said earlier. So you have scale economic gains from the expansion of downstream sectors, and you have the competitive advantage losses by producing something that you could have been imported. And the theory here generates a key testable implication is that mineral export restrictions could only improve welfare if downstream manufacturing expand. This makes sense. So if downstream manufacturing sector do not expand, then basically you are hurting the mining sector with nobody to gain, right? So the empirical part of this paper just tests this assumption. So the first one is, do mineral export restrictions really increase downstream exports? And the second one is, do the effects spill over into broader industrial upgrading, which means that which sectors benefit from such policy, to what extent the effects could propagate through the value chain beyond the medium downstream sectors. Okay, so data. So I'm using this global trade alert data from 2008 to 2023, and I extract all mineral export restrictions from this database. Mineral export restrictions is the export restriction measures targeting mineral products, which are two HS chapters. The 25, which is non-metallic minerals, and 26, which is the metallic minerals. Okay, so we have 125 policy measures implemented by 29 countries. So all these countries are developing countries. Apparently, like developed countries are not very interested in such measures. And also, developed countries are faced certain kinds of WTO restrictions so that they could not set arbitrary export restrictions. And for downstream products, I'm using this new data set compiled by Feather et al. In 2004, which is the AI-generated product network. Okay, so they use AI models to predict, to match each mineral with its possible downstream products at a very disaggregated level, which is HS6 level. So I'm not using conventional IO tables here because conventional IO table could not give you predictions of these linkages between individual minerals and their downstream products. Okay. And finally, I'm using trade data, which is highly conventional from the Bashi dataset from 2002 to 2023. So this is an example of the AIPNet data that I just talked about. So every dot here is a HS6 level products. And every product here originated from these two red dots, which are iron ores. Okay, so you could produce iron steel products using iron ores, but to the like downstream of the value chain, you could see you have car bodies, engines and tablewares. All this stuff could be produced using iron ores, but they are located in different stages of the value chain, right? So my empirical strategy is very simple. It's just a triple differences. This is for targeted minerals. So apparently the Y would be the export and ER would be the treatment variable. And here I assume that the export restrictions is absorptive at the country product level. Because of course for DID estimators you need absorptive treatment, but I do have a lot of heterogeneous robust estimators later, and all regressions are estimated using PPML because I have a lot of zeros in these trade flows. Okay, so this is for the targeted minerals. This is simple, but I have the similar thing for the downstream products. For the downstream products, you need to match the products itself with their upstream products. So ER upstream IKT here is that it equals to 1 if any of these upstream minerals of K is a downstream product now, is restricted. And because some countries also have restrictions to the downstream product themselves, so I control for the blue term, which is if product K itself is restricted. And again, all these restrictions are estimated using PPL. Okay, so let's come to the results. So for targeted mineral, this is sanity check. Of course, you see a large decrease, large drop in exports of these targeted minerals after policy, which means the policies are actually doing something, okay? And the results are very large. And for the event study, you could see that there's no pre-trend. So every effect you observed happened after the policy implementation. So this is a sanity check again. But for the apparently I missed a slide here, but you could just look at the event study results here, which is the downstream products, you see an export stimulating effect in downstream products. So apparently after policy implementation, the exports of these downstream products of these restricted minerals increase, and the effect is, I believe, 11% in value and 19% in quantity. Okay, and the effects are actually increasing along the time. Okay, so now there's something interesting. How do you define the upstreamness or downstreamness of products in the value chain? So here I'm using a conventional theorem in graph theory, which is called Tyan theorem, which could build a stage measure like from a graph. Of course, like the data is a production network, okay? So every product is linked to different products, and there are a lot of cycles are inside. So if you have cycles in a network, you don't have this stage measure, okay? So Tyan algorithm basically it cut off these cycles and give you the so-called strongly connected components so that you could define the relative downstreamness originating from one product. For example, in this figure, you can see the product 0 and product 7, apparently they are at the stage 1 because everything originated from these two products, okay? So give you a summary. So here stage 0 are the minerals. So you have 109 minerals here. And for the downstream products, they are like assigned into stage 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on, okay? So this is just a summary statistics, but when it's mapped to different individual products, you could see something, okay? So stage 1, you have pig iron. Of course, this is very primary processed good. It's not the iron ore, but only go through one stage of processing. And then you have more and more complex stuff, and you have the car bodies and aeroplanes and stuff in stage 7, 8, which are highly complex and downstream in the value chain. Okay, so why I'm doing this? Because I'm running the regression again, but for different stages of this value chain, and the result will look like this. So for stage 0, these are the sanity checks that you already seen, which the export restrictions just curbing the exports of targeted minerals. But for downstream products, you only see the increasing effects in stage 1, which are the immediate downstream stage. From stage 2 and on, you see nothing, and even for some stages, there are negative coefficients, which means the country's economy increasingly focus on the most immediate downstream stage, which are the processing of these raw minerals. But they are only the very early stage of processing that do not go into further stages. And what products are inside this stage 1? And you can see they are basically those base metal products, okay? For example, you have the iron ores, so you are doing some metallurgy, you are melting these iron ores into different iron steel products, but you are not making, say, machinery, transport equipment, or instrument, okay? So you are just doing this base metal processing. So what is the barriers behind this? I highlight these two stuff, which are technology complexity and input requirements. And you can see only the products with the lowest complexity and input requirements have the highest result. And for the medium and high groups, basically you see nothing and non-significant results, okay? So which highlights a key concern of such policy is that you are subsidizing the mineral inputs, but other than mineral inputs, you still need other things like technology, okay, like other complementary inputs. So by mineral export restriction itself, you cannot induce broader industrial upgrading. Okay, so I'm doing a lot of robustness checks, but I don't have time, so I just skip. Okay, I'll conclude. So this paper studies mineral export restrictions as an industrial policy tool. So it implicitly subsidizes downstream manufacturing, but its welfare gains are theoretically ambiguous depending on whether the downstream scale externalities could be activated or whether the downstream expansion are observed in reality. However, this condition is largely unmet in practice. Why? Because the gains are limited in narrow downstream sectors, very closed, actually closest to raw minerals, and the technology and inputs continue serving as barriers for these countries to move up the value chain. So I had this paper, of course, has some policy implications, which is the developing countries should really exercise extra caution in pursuing such policies because they cannot create comparative advantage from scratch. You need skilled labor, you need technology other than these raw minerals. Right. Thank you very much.
I have mostly brief comments because this is an excellent paper. And actually, I would encourage you guys all to read it. Generally, that's not the case at these conferences. Like, great presentation, but the paper has a lot more. It's really well written. So it addresses an important issue in both developing and developed countries. Developed countries can't quite do this, but they somewhat do other things that are a little bit similar. And also, as a paper, it hits this perfect balance between having some nice theory and real empirics and some really, really good data work to get all of this together. So just some suggestions that I have. I mean, I think it's a very thorough paper, but there are sort of small and large country effects here, as well as small and large country home market effects that I think are important. And it might be nice to see this. I mean, this seems to show up in the empirics as something that's important. And it would be nice to sort of have that. You're not going to build it into the theory. That would make it too complicated. But to have some of that and to dig deeper in the empirics, a little bit of where you might see this and where you might see success. I think there's in the paper, there's a nice kind of carve out of what's going on in China as maybe something different. And I think the sort of large market effects are maybe some of that story. Also, this is mostly, I think, a short-term effect that you're finding, and potentially the reason you would do this if you're Uganda is, 25 years from now, we will be in the aerospace business or something, right? You can hear Museveni saying exactly that, right? So I think thinking about that, about that sort of short versus long term. So you find not very good effects in the short term, but that may well be because there might still be long-term effects that would make this worthwhile. I think the other thing, and you mentioned it at the beginning of your talk, but FDI doesn't really show up in this, and I think that's an important thing. In part, actually, those quotes from Museveni are the sort of thing that might chase away any FDI, right? Like if you were going to invest in Uganda and the president said, well, we're going to do whatever I want. It sounds like some large country that I actually come from as a president that's a little bit that way. It does not inspire confidence. But I think there's a way in which these there's sort of these bans crowd out FDI, that, oh, well, if you're going to ban us from buying your nickel, we're going to just find some other place to get nickel, but we're definitely not investing in your country. And so that could explain some of these adverse effects. I think also thinking about different human capital outcomes. I guess there, I think it's possible to think about a world where at a certain human capital level, at a certain maybe FDI level, or a certain country size in terms of export market, these policies might work. And actually, I'd encourage you to think about, okay, what would that look like, and can we go back to the data and see if there's any evidence of that? I suspect there probably isn't, but it would be useful to close off that door and to be able to say, okay, even if you have all of these conditions in place, there's no evidence that these policies work or work as intended. Okay, that's.
Thanks, Jeremy, for this insightful comments, and thanks for the great words. So the model, currently the small versus large country effects, I do have a small thing in the model, but it's more on the mineral side. So I do have whether the country's export restrictions could shape the world prices. So if it's a small country, then the world won't care if you ban or not ban your or don't ban your minerals. But it's very important, as you said, to also introduce the so-called home market effects, not on the minerals, but on the manufacturing stuff. I'm not sure whether I'm be able to model this in the theory, but at least for the empirical side, I should do some country level heterogeneity at the same as the human capital levels. As you can see, that the current version focuses more on the product level heterogeneity, and I should do some results on the country level. And for the short and long-term effects, this is every time I'm presenting this paper, people will ask about this. I would say at least for the sample period that I'm choosing from 2002, basically 2008 to 2025, these are the 15 years period, you see nothing. So if you can see something downstream, then at least for the event study graph, you can see there's an increasing trend for the downstream exports, but they are still only for the domestic, like for the very early stage. So whether this would translate later into other sectors still remain to be answered. So. And for the FDI, this is very important, and this is what everything starts. It starts from I read an article about the Indonesia strategy attracting Chinese FDI by banning the nickels. But of course, as you said, the Ugandan president, probably saying something that would chase out the FDI. So I'm working with an FDI data right now, but the FDI data, of course, is not granular as the trade data adds. So probably I could have 1 or 2 tables on that, but I'm working on that.
Often I think when we talk about upgrading, we end up then focusing very much on like the production side of things. And I was wondering, I mean, it's like a monumental data effort. If there's anything you're thinking about doing or can do in terms of looking at like the other activities beyond production that might be impacted by these kind of
So
mineral export restrictions.
do you have any specific activities in your mind, or?
I mean, like, I think about the smile curve. You kind of got the production, and you got your logistics, you got your R&D, you got your design, you got your sales. I mean, I'm not saying low-income countries are gonna suddenly go to R&D, but like the kind of more services, I suppose, side of things beyond the goods.
I see. So for this paper, I don't think I have any evidence on the activities pretty much because I'm focusing on trade, which is the only data sources that you could look at the individual minerals. So for other activities, they are not specific to individual minerals. They're more like a macro stuff. As you said, like logistic would happen to every sectors if you are having some industrial policy in that. But I think I do have some evidence on domestic production, but as I said, it's still on the production side. But of course, maybe I could do some heterogeneity check by, for example, bending the country into their logistic performance, into their local services availability. And I believe these factors would also act as somewhat barriers to the production of the mineral-related products. But yeah, I think I can have some data to see a word on that.
Thank you for the interesting presentation. I have one clarification and one sort of question about how to interpret results. So one is about the sample. So I wasn't quite sure whether your sample covers entire world, like
Yes.
entire countries in
Yeah.
the world.
Yes.
Is it the case?
So I have two specifications. The first one is to have every countries around the world. So developed countries would act as pure controls because you have nothing there. Another sample is that you only restrict your focus on developing countries, but they show very similar results.
I see. One thing I was thinking is because your sample period, like you said, is pretty long, and it also includes recent years,
Yes.
which is sort of affected by Trump, trade
Geopolitics, yeah.
policy. So like I was thinking like if there is any sort of contamination effect by including that period, I think like for country like Asia, like a supply chain has been quite affected by the trade war. So like whether that kind of affects your results.
So I think I have two answers to this. The first one is that every export restrictions here I documented apply to all trade partners. So they are not these geopolitical ones saying that US restricting something export to China or China restricting rare earths. So I don't have rare earth metals here actually. So these are for the domestic looking policies. And also for the robustness check, I tried to exclude these large actors. For example, I exclude China from my sample, and the results all look similar. But for other geopolitical factors, maybe I could, I don't know, maybe I could have a model to see what happens, for example, retaliation, but it will look a little bit more complicated. Yeah.
And another question is, so you're looking at the implication for downstream exports. I was wondering if there is any response on the downstream production to the domestic economy,
Yes.
because it looks like a bit of the jump to expect that
Yes,
the downstream sector start exporting.
Yeah, because domestic production data are notoriously hard to measure, but I do have some indirect measure. For example, I looked into the mine production, and I see that the mine production are not actually decreased by such products, so by policies. So the mines are still producing these minerals, and the exports of mines curbed. So definitely you have some more domestic absorption of these minerals. And also I focus on the mirror image of downstream production, which are the imports of the downstream products by these countries. And you can see these countries import less of these downstream products, which again shows a little bit of evidence on downstream production to be expanded.
So there is some upgrading on the
Yeah.
domestic.
We're going to talk about climate change and conflict. And this is joint work with my graduate student, Chengshou Jing, who has done all of the good data work that's here. And I'm just sort of along for the ride and presenting what we found. So what we're trying to do is look at this nexus between climate change and conflict, and there's a large literature on this. And what we're going to do is basically try to throw everything that we can at this and try to understand how this literature fits together. Because in particular, the literature has very heterogeneous findings. So armed conflict, oh, by the way, we're looking at the African continent here. So armed conflict is a major barrier to economic development, human security across all of Africa. And there's this growing body of research and that has shown that potentially climate shocks, rainfall deficits, rising temperatures, droughts, contribute to the risk of conflict. And in some cases, it finds that it actually reduces the risk of conflict. The existing studies produce very mixed evidence. And here, let me just show you this. This is from a review paper by Burke, Ferguson, Shang, and Miguel that looks at what you have is for a one standard deviation change in conflict in climate, the effect on conflict. And you have at the bottom here some like 50% increase, a drought might get you a 50% increase in conflict. But at the top, you have similar negative 10%. And almost all of these are all published papers, so they're all significant. really, right? You can't get it published if it's not. But this suggests that there's, like, we actually don't know what's going on, right? This is sort of almost a measure of our ignorance, I think. This paper itself, and mind you, these authors are in some of these papers, and they're in both positive and negative papers. But they conclude in this paper that, see, it's really a positive effect, that bad climate will produce more conflict. And I think all of us would love this to be true, right? You know, climate change is bad, conflict is bad, this bad thing produces more of this other bad thing. And so if we could get rid of this one bad thing, we'd have less of this other bad thing. And so, you know, if that's how it works, we could all be happy. So what we're going to do is we're going to use grid cell data, 55-kilometer grids, across all of Africa, or with a few holes you'll see in our map, combining conflict events, satellite climate data, and land cover information. And actually, this land cover information is one of the ways we're innovating on this literature. We're going to use the Chernozhukov method of double debiased machine learning, which is this big black box of you can get causality out of something that doesn't have causality. And, you know, I'm not sure I totally believe what we're doing is perfect. But it allows us to look at how climate responses vary by climate shock type, rainfall versus temperature, exposure, high exposure to yourself, to your neighbors, and different ecological land systems. And so the main finding is that the effects of climate shocks on conflict vary substantially across different land types. So they're not the same in the desert, in the savanna, in forest zones. And they also vary across exposure types. So there's both strong ecological and spatial heterogeneity going on here. So things where we're contributing, one is the shock heterogeneity. So we compare both positive and negative rainfall shocks and positive and negative temperature shocks within a single empirical framework. My suspicion in a lot of this literature is that they tested all these shocks and one of them was significant, so that's what got published. And so we want to do all of it and understand, you know, if there are asymmetries in positive and negative responses. The other thing we're doing is paying strong attention to spatial spillovers. So I think in a couple slides, I'll basically tell you that most of this literature is a giant Sutva violation. So pays no attention to what happens in neighboring cells. But the thing is, we know about Africa that a lot of these conflicts are about, say, herders moving from a drought zone into an area with rainfall. So the conflict is actually not due to what happens in the pixel we're measuring, but in a neighboring pixel, or maybe even one farther away. And so if you don't account for that, you're actually, well, I don't think, doing this right. And then we're going to look at different ecological zones, and because these mechanisms are going to be different across these zones. Okay, so our data is built off of a paper by McGurk and Nunn that actually focuses mostly on conflicts around livestock herders, but actually going to how this literature is built. They have a paper on mostly livestock herders, but they assembled a data set that's very comprehensive that includes all of the continent. Their published paper only has, you know, the Sahel. So you know, that maybe that's how they started out. So there's we're going to have, we've got conflict data from ACLED, rainfall from CHIRPS, temperature from ERA5, and land cover classifications. And future versions will have robustness checks to other versions of all of these data, but at the moment this is what we have. So here's our coverage. There are strange holes in, some places, okay, that's the desert, but in other places we do have some strange holes in the middle of Africa. But basically this is our land cover coverage. And so I mentioned this inference problem that treatment, so we're going to have this problem that treatment assigned to one unit actually is going to affect other units. This is the interference problem, or non-Sutva. And so what we're going to do is use what's happening in adjacent cells as also one of the treatments, which basically create an exposure map. So we're going to take the 8 cells around you, which is basically an extra 55 kilometers in every direction. And when those neighboring cells have a climate event, if 25% of your neighboring cells have a climate event, we're going to say, okay, your neighbors were treated. And so we're going to have multiple versions of this, of our treatment. So your cell can be treated, just your neighbor's cells can be treated, or you and your neighbors can all be treated, like a drought that hits the whole area. So this is the exposure mapping. It has some fancy names, but it's actually really simple. The central cell is the red one, and if a quarter of the blue cells are treated, we're going to say this is treatment. So that's 2 out of the 8 of those cells. So this treatment, there's basically our mapping is the z equals 0. Basically, this is a control zone where you yourself are not treated, your neighbors are not treated either. The z equals 1 is spillover only. That is, your neighbors are treated. So that's it doesn't rain in neighboring areas, but it does rain in your area. Then there's direct low exposure. You have a climate treatment, but not your neighbors. And then high exposure, direct high exposure, you and your neighbors are all being treated. Treatments are basically class-specific anomalies. We use trailing past rainfall or temperature to generate a 1 standard deviation change to see if you had that 1 standard deviation. So we're going to have drought. We have rain surplus, we have heat, and we have cold. And each of those is a 1 standard deviation plus or minus to normal. And normal is on a rolling basis of the previous 10 years. Okay, so this is the high exposure on the left. You're treated and some of your neighbors are treated. We're going to compare that to just your neighbors were treated. The direct low exposure, just you were treated, assuming that, and compared to other places that aren't treated. This is what basically the literature is doing, is measuring this. And then there's the spillover exposure, that the areas around you are treated, but you yourself are not treated, and that's your compared to controls. Okay, so the double debiased machine learning, this is sort of the best figure that I could find, sort of explaining what it is. I think the thing to understand is that it's actually a matching method. So I'm old enough to remember when we were doing matching methods, and I also was one of those people that had a matching method paper that I sent out to journals, and everybody said, "No, we're not doing that anymore. You know, it's not at all valid inference." But you know, thank you, they brought it back. Um, the matching is this. It's basically predicting treatment. So essentially, we're matching areas that are similar, where one is treated and another one is not. And we're running this predicting the outcome based on covariates. We're running that as a random forest. This one is run as a logistics. And then we can bring these together, and basically, in the end, you get a simple regression. Once you've basically come up with your treatment residuals and your outcome residuals. Okay, and then we do the k-fold cross-validation. So we train it on 4 parts of the data, and we test it on another, and we go through that in an iterative process to make sure it works. Okay, so that is all of the technical part, which what do our results look like? Okay, so this is, the key thing is up here in this corner. This is cropland areas. High exposure is both you and your neighbors are exposed. And we find that higher temperatures increases the probability of conflict. Low exposure is just you. So that's really what the literature is trying to measure, or has been trying to measure. We find no effective rainfall. But spillovers, when there's drought in your neighboring areas, then there's an increased probability of conflict in your area. So this is kind of like what you see in Nigeria, where there's drought in a neighboring area and the livestock herders come in, and now you have conflict. But you don't see it if everybody's exposed, right? So that's over here. We find no effect if everybody in the zone is exposed. We do also find low temperature has an effect if it's just on your local area. And that actually is this sort of shows up in a number of these. We go to the forest zone, rainfall doesn't matter. These are zones where there's actually a lot of rainfall, so variations in that don't matter much. Temperature does matter in your own zone, but high temperatures actually reduce the probability of conflict. In shrubland, we don't see much of an effect. We do see some effect for high rainfall in your neighboring zones, reduces your probability of conflict. In grasslands, again, we see relatively little with rainfall, but we do see temperature effects for your own zone. So temperature effects within your area, the higher temperatures actually reduce conflict, lower temperatures increase conflict. In drylands, now we see that low rainfall across the whole area increases conflict. So this is kind of the result that the literature suggests, right? That is it suggests this is true across Africa, is that when it doesn't rain at all, there's a lot of conflict. But this is true for drylands. It is also true if that happens in your neighboring areas, but not yours. So that's kind of, you can think of that as the farmer-herder conflict result. And that's kind of consistent with that. Somewhat similar in the desert, where There are not many people and not a lot of conflict, but we mostly only find a result of low rainfall actually, if it's in your own zone, reduces conflict. So we have this high rainfall, like flooding, has negative effects on conflict in shrubland, drylands, and desert. Drought has a positive effect on conflicts in cropland and dryland. Hot temperature has a negative effect on conflicts in forest and grassland for low exposure. Cold has the opposite effect in cropland, grasslands, and dryland. Temperatures seem to have only effects locally, like within your pixel, your 55-kilometer zone. And so that's one of those things we find. So our work is consistent with a lot of these papers. We find some of the effects that they find, only we don't find them everywhere. So the flood high rainfall in neighboring cells is like work by Raleigh and Nivton and Benjaminson. The drought in neighboring cells producing higher conflict is like Burke and Miguel and Harari and McGurk and Nunn. The heat shocks in low exposure places, also like Raleigh and Nivton and Dell, Jones, and Olkin. And these cold shocks also are match with some other papers too. So we find these the effects that are in the literature. We also find lots of other effects and a lot of non-effects that I think are maybe more important. So in some ways, this is a null result paper. And we're trying to prove the null result by having some of these real effects too. I'm going to skip the robustness checks. We have them. So basically, we do find that climate shocks influence conflict risk, but it's highly heterogeneous. It's highly heterogeneous by agroecozone and by whether this shock is local to you or about your neighbors. And the rainfall shocks, the conflict responses are primarily driven by neighboring effects. So that's the livestock herders who move into your zone, or refugees of some sort moving over that generate spillover pressure. And the temperature shocks are actually very local. So this different land systems suggest different mechanisms. So agricultural productivity shocks in cropland are important, and pastoral mobility is this is not news to anybody, but is a really big deal in this, and resource competition in drylands. But these results also explain why that first graph I showed have mixed results, because you should find mixed results, because that's actually what's going on. Terms of policy implications, because of these strong spillovers, climate adaptation should be coordinated across neighboring zones. So that's true for pixels, but should be true for regions and countries, et cetera. And the neighboring climate impacts matter as much as direct exposure. But there should be sort of different conflict prevention strategies for different ecosystems. Okay, that's my story.
Thank you very much. That was a wonderful presentation. I think what I find most interesting and refreshing is the hybrid approach that you took. Usually we see papers that are either pure prediction, which are great for early warnings, but of course not the pure reduced form, right? But I think I have just two comments. You use 110 kilometer radius, right, for your exposure mapping, which I think is interesting. But in the world of pastoralism, especially in the northern part of Nigeria, I think it's usually the case that 110 kilometer might not be enough. I think so. I would love to see how stable, for example, this amplification effects are if we play with that special decay function. I think that would be an interesting thing to look at. You also control for lag conflict, which I think is the usual gold standard, right? Especially for persistence. But I was thinking, what about infrastructure state capacity, for example? Does a rainfall shock in a cell with a paved road or a police station, for example, look the same as one in a remote community? So I was thinking that that would be something to look at. I suspect that the land type or effect that you are seeing might be proxying for that remoteness or some sort of state capture, right? I think that's pretty much my comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you for those comments. I actually, as I was talking about the 110-kilometer distance, I was thinking, well, that's kind of dumb. That's not enough. And particularly because, as we know, livestock herders go over long distances. I'm not sure how feasible that will be, because then you start getting into other problems as you add in more data and more distances. Wait, your second point was the like infrastructure and ruggedness. Yeah, I think that's another thing that we can bring in here, and might be an important mitigating effect, as or not, I guess, in this. So questions? Yeah, Chen.
Related to your point is that in many parts of the African continent, actually, the rules of these herders are actually fixed. It's like not fixed in a very micro state, but macroly. Like, for example, in the Sahelian region, it's always like the northern herders migrating to the northern part for the better climate conditions. So the spillover effects to different risks may have a directional stuff. Like,
Right.
maybe it only spill over to the south and grid not to
That might be a way to get identification over longer distances that we can't otherwise. If we just say, oh, we're going to go to 500 kilometers, then we're just going to attenuate everything. But clearly, yeah, like in the Sahel, it's sort of a north-south, and there are corridors that we could look for in there. This is sort of the problem with saying, okay, we're going to do the whole continent, is that then the specifics of any one place get very hard to put in there, but I think there's some of that, and actually in this case, like, I know the cell reasonably well, but are there livestock corridors in Mozambique? I don't know. And it might be dangerous to put in some places where we know and not in others.
whether you could like have different estimates for the spillover effects in different directions, but I'm pretty sure that we will at some point even hit the curse of dimensionality.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, interestingly, we started this and we're like, wow, machine learning's great, and we have all this data. And we showed our early results to a bunch of machine learning people, and we walk in with our 20,000 data points, and they're like, yeah, if you don't have 1 million, you really can't do the really good stuff. So I think that's our curse of dimensionality.
Thank you. Just one question. So since you're using the double bias machine learning of the children's schools, I was wondering, like, you actually try to formally estimate the treatment heterogeneity, because I think machine learning allows you to actually quantify the variable importance.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, for example, there are several other factors which might affect the difference in effects. So, like a discussant talking about state fragility, it could be related to, like you said, agriculture, or it could be related to MNEs, because there are a lot of FDI coming to the continent, and actually that is creating deforestation, conflict. So I think there are lots of possible factors that can actually change the relationship between the climate and conflict.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, because Cholonsky have a methodology to actually formally estimate the treatment effect heterogeneity. So I was wondering if you have thought about it.
Like, do we get a sort of effect heterogeneity measure?
Yeah, like you can actually include different confounding factors.
In the treatment.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, I think the way we think about what we're doing is by dividing the sample. We're allowing that heterogeneity by dividing by ecozone type. But you're right that we could add other confounding factors
Because there
into.
is a process of random forest. So like actually through this process, actually they can point, machine learning can point which factors are more important than others.
Yeah.
So like I think there is a methodology to actually rank the variable importance.
So the way we started this paper, that actually, our discussant actually saw that part of the paper where we were actually trying to figure out which of these are the most important factors, and that turned out to be actually less satisfying than we thought it would be. In part because I think the machine learning, every factor matters a little bit, and it doesn't have the cleanness that actually we like in economics, where it's this factor or that factor. But I'll think about whether we can have sort of confounding factors in the
strengths in your paper. So.
All right, last question, and then we should get.
Thanks, Jeremy. Very nice paper. So I really like how you started by showing these very mixed results in the literature. So I was just thinking, and of course your results sort of has added to this because you saw all kinds of results, positive, negative. So it's sort of added to that mixed evidence in the literature. So I was just thinking perhaps the role of the source of like the rain data you use, the temperature you use, because I think from the literature or recent studies that results are highly driven by the source. So perhaps we are seeing very kinds of different results because researchers are using different sources, because you have up to like 5-6 standard sources. You can use temperature, So now to my question, I was just thinking in your study, how much of robustness have you checked using all available sources of rain, temperature? Because I have a feeling that the outcome may move depending. So I don't know. I just wanted to check. Thanks.
And it's a great suggestion. It's exactly the next thing that we're going to do with this. We've done the robustness checks that I went through quickly. We're just changing within the data that we're currently using. And I think the most interesting ones are, okay, is what we're finding an artifact of the data, being, the rainfall data being bad. If you saw, there was a paper on Sunday that was about, don't trust any rainfall data across Africa. And so I think we should redo this with all 5 and see if we come up with similar stories. And also true, the agroeco zones, there's not a fixed definition of that. There are 5 different ways, or probably 20 different ways to do agroeco zones. There's also 2 different conflict data sets. There's different measures of conflict. Right now we're using just anything that the ACLED data says is a conflict. So anyway, yeah, I think that's the next thing that we need to do. But let me not take the time away from our next presenter. And so that's it.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Mohammed Kabir. This is a joint paper with my PhD student, Issa Musa, and of course, Sanusi. The resource cost literature has spent almost about 30 years arguing about whether resources are blessings or a curse. And the answer has increasingly converged to it depends on institutions. There's been little, surprisingly, would I say, systematic work on which feature of resource wealth matters. Could it be resource levels? Could it be the dependency itself? Or is it the volatility? So this paper think the volatility dimension has been underdeveloped, and this is what we try to do. So we constructed a resource volatility index to show that volatile commodity prices systematically erode governance quality. So let me start with a puzzle most of you, of course, recognize. Essentially, you have Norway discovering oil, builds a sovereign wealth fund, world-class institution. You have Botswana, finds diamonds, and becomes one of African governance success story. I think Asimogwan et al. Had shown a whole lot about Botswana. Then you have Nigeria and Venezuela. For Nigeria, you have decades of wealth, and yet governance indicators have barely moved. Venezuela, on the other side, is Latin American richest country once, and now you know what the story is, right? So the question is, same resource wealth, why different outcomes? The standard answer in the literature is institutions, right? The whole grabber-friendly versus producer-friendly conversation. And yes, institutions matter, but institutions don't explain essentially the timing of governance deterioration. For example, institutions are slow moving, commodity prices are not. If governance quality wasn't sharply in specific years, the key question you may want to ask is what then is driving that deterioration in those specific years? And this is where we think price volatility matters. So it's not just having the resources that matters, it is how widely those resources swing around over the years, right? And when you look at what commodity prices have actually done over the past 2 decades, you can see why this is important. This chart shows the crude oil and copper prices from 2000 to 2020, right? Oil at, would I say, $18 in 2000, around 2000, right? And then rocketing up to $95 by 2008, then jumping to around $40 in 2009, which is like a 58% decline. Now, I think what is very important here is then to understand, suppose you are the finance minister of the country and seeing all of this, how would you plan, right? I think the third author was involved in policy execution in Nigeria, and he had asked questions about how do this really, what should the finance minister, for example, think about in terms of whether these fluctuations have specific policy implications for the government. And I think this was part of what motivated the PhD student to begin to work on this area. Now, so that's the empirical context. What we're simply doing here is our research question is quite straightforward. How does natural resource price volatility affect governance quality and corruption control? I think the distinction between governance quality and corruption control is, I would say, is deliberate because we think that the channels may be quite different. In terms of contribution to the literature, we make 3 distinct contributions. First is on measurement. The resource volatility index is not, to my knowledge, something anyone has constructed in quite this way before. The key innovation is combining country-specific exposure with commodity price dynamics. So it's not just, are you a resource exporter, for example, which is what I think Sachs and Warner were doing with their original paper. It's not even how dependent are you on resources, which is what the most subsequent literature uses. It is how volatile is your specific basket of resource export this particular year. And I think this is a meaningful, would I say, different question, and it should yield a meaningful different measure. The second is identification. Correlation between resource measures and governance is quite large in the literature. The literature is full of them, right? Causal claims are very hard to make here. So we attempted to use two strategies, instrumental variable approach that exploit global commodity price shock, interacted with pre-sample export composition, and a difference in difference design built around the 2008, 2009 financial crisis as an exogenous shock to resource revenue. I would say that the instrumental variable approach borrows essentially from the strategy of Bazzi and Blattman, 2014, which use commodity price shock, which look at commodity price shock and conflict, right? But this is adapted for governance context, right? Now, the third contribution we think we made is on the issue of heterogeneity, and I'll say more about this later on. But the headline is that the effects are profoundly unequal across the different income levels and institutional quality. And of course, I think to see why this is important, it helps us to understand where the existing literature has left gap. First, the existing measures, I would say, are largely static. They use fixed export ratios. Country X export, for example, would I say 30% of oil, but they don't capture the volatilities of those prices from year to year, right? So static ratio, I think, means the dynamic story. The existing resource volatility, the existing resource cost literature also are very narrow, for example. You see very clearly the focus is on oil and it overlooks other commodity impact. But resource costs isn't just about petroleum. Countries export copper, iron ore, for example, cocoa and coffee. And I think this is very important, especially for many African exporting commodity countries. So a narrow focus on oil, I think, would overlook this dynamic effect. Also, the third issue is existing work tends to average effect across all countries, but a one standard deviation shock doesn't mean the same thing in Norway as it does in Chad, for example, right? So I think these are the important issues that we look at. In terms of what is the mechanism through which resource volatility or resource price volatility might impact on governance? I want to be very careful here because the political economy of resource wealth has been thoroughly theorized. You have Besley and Persson having the standard literature. What we are doing is identifying three channels that are specific to volatility as opposed to the level of resource income. The first channel is fiscal uncertainty, and this is perhaps the most straightforward mechanism. When government revenue is a function of global commodity prices, And in many in many resource-dependent states, resource revenue constitute about 40, 50, 60% of fiscal income, right? Price volatility translates directly into budgetary volatility. And the consequence is that government cannot credibly commit to long-term institutional investment. So the time horizon of political decision-making becomes something else, hostile to institutional investment and all of that. Now, this connects you directly to Collier's argument about natural resource traps and stuff like that. So we are arguing that the trap is likely sprung by volatility, specifically, not just by the resource wealth per se. The next is rent-seeking intensification. This builds on the standard political economy story, the voracity effect, which look at rent-seeking in resource economies. During boom period, when commodity prices are high, rents are large, the incentive to capture those rent intensify. Elite compete more aggressively for control of resource revenue. It could be the case that institutional constraints such as checks and balances, the transparency mechanisms get circumvented because the price is too large to leave on the table, right? And what volatility adds to the literature here is then the urgency. If you know the boom might end at any point in time, the incentive to grab what you can is there, right? I think that's the channel. Again, this is just static analysis, not the dynamic story is not added to the model. Of course, the last channel is political instability. Revenue volatility threatens political survival. Leaders prioritize short-term gains over institutional reform. And this is likely to lead to fall in accountability. Now, let me show you how we actually operationalize the resource volatility index itself. The resource volatility index is a sheer, the resource volatility index for country I in year T is the sum across all commodity J of the export share weight times the volatility sigma. In plain English, it means we take a country-specific exposure to each commodity, how much of your exports, for example, are oil, how much are copper, how much are cocoa, and then we multiply that by the actual price volatility of each commodity in that year, measured as the standard deviation of monthly log price changes. Now, the commodities we covered include crude oil and natural gas, coal, copper, aluminium, gold, iron, ore, as well as commodities such as wheat, maize, soybeans, coffee, and cocoa. The data came from the Chatham House resourcetrade.eth database, which I think is genuinely excellent, but still underutilized in the literature. Of course, the price data came from Fred. Now, let me quickly mention 3 key advantages of we think is associated with the resource volatility index. First is heterogeneous exposure. An oil exporter and a copper exporter face different volatility profile, even in the same year. And the resource volatility index reflects that. Second advantage is that it's time varying. And this annual variation allows us for temporal identification. And third is that it's extensible. It's easily updated with new commodity data. So if you want to add lithium or cobalt, for example, which are increasingly relevant, you could slot them in without changing the methodology. All right. So what does the measure actually look like? So the resource volatility index has a mean of just under 1, 0.997, standard deviation of 0.702 range, which ranges essentially from 0 to 5. So there is enormous cross-country overtime variation to exploit. Now, the histogram shows us most observations are clustered between 0.5 to 1, 1.5, which reflects approximately 38% of the observations we have in the sample. But those that have high resource volatility index, observation above 2.5 are countries that are most exposed. For example, you have Iraq, Angola, Republic of Congo, Equatorial Guinea, in those with higher 2.5 down to 3 points. A few other things worth noting from these descriptives is that governance indicator centered around 0, which is by construction, because these are the worldwide governance indicator from the World Bank, which are constructed with 0 mean and unit variance globally. I think now, what is our empirical strategy? Well, we used correlated random effect model. Of course, this includes time average effects of all time varying regressors as additional control, which effectively relaxes the assumption that country-specific effects are uncorrelated with the regressors. This gives us both a within-country coefficient, beta 1, capturing the short-run effect when your resource volatility index changes. And of course, beta 2 captures the between-country coefficient. So the advantage of this, of course, both OLS and the correlated random effect alone won't give us any some sort of causality. So we deploy 3 additional identification strategy, which I already mentioned in the previous slide. So what did we find? Now let me show you the baseline results. Okay. So here are the headline numbers. In the short run, a 1 standard deviation increase in the resource volatility index is associated with a 0.198 standard deviation decrease in corruption control. That is the within country contemporaneous effect with the full set of control significant at 1%. In the long run, the between country time averaged effect is minus 0.45 for government effectiveness, which is also highly significant. So persistent exposure to high volatility has even larger effect than year-to-year fluctuation, right? This is the IV estimation, and which I would just quickly jump on. And this is the difference in difference estimation. Now, I think what I want to show is some key findings from the full paper. The volatility effect affects all governance dimension. It's consistent effect across all governance indicator. For the rule of law, it's negative 2.67. Corruption control generally is negative 2.38. Regulatory quality and voice and accountability. So it's consistent across board. Now, I think this is the most interesting slide. When we split the sample by World Bank income classification, the gradient is monotonic. in the sense that the resource volatility coefficient for low-income countries is negative 0.398, which is nearly 4/10 of the standard deviation, right? White lower middle income country is 0.312. White for middle high income countries, it's 0.198. But for high income countries, it's negative 0.089, which is almost not statistically significant. Why is this important? This means wealthy countries have institutional buffers that absorb price shocks, but low-income countries lack these buffers, which almost entirely, right? So they typically have narrow tax base, underdeveloped financial sectors, as well as weak rule of law. And that is the key messages that we found. We also estimate a non-linear threshold effect, and we found that resource volatility index below a threshold of 0.670 has lower manageable impact compared to when it's above the threshold. And you see that the impact more than double above the threshold of 0.670. Now, very quickly, what is the policy implication of this? First, we think that fiscal stabilization is important. Wet fund counter-cyclical rules to insulate budget from price swing. And this should be priority for countries with high resource volatility index. And of course, the extractive transparency initiative should be adopted because this promotes some sort of public accountability, right? And the standard recommendation will be economic diversification, diversify from volatile commodity into manufacturing and services to lower resource volatility index. And of course, international support should be tied to lower income countries when these volatilities are high. Thank you.
So the paper constructs a new resource volatility index to examine how natural resource price volatility affects the governance quality, and which the index itself is novel. It combines the different kinds of minerals and the country's exposure to their volatility on the international market. But my key question for the paper is that is the paper identifying a volatility effect or a broader resource price or a revenue shock effect, which is the first order effect versus the second order effect. So I'm saying this because the RVI index constructed by this paper is a shift share structure, of course. It combines the time varying weights and the volatility term. So I think there are some comments could be addressed in these two parts. So for the time varying weights, of course, the export structure of this country is endogenous to the governance and policy itself. So probably the governments could take some policies to feature some resource exports versus others. So it could introduce a little bit of endogeneity into this index. But I think there's a concern about the volatility term, which use the contemporaneous price movement. But the contemporaneous price movement would be affected by large price shock because price shock affects the levels and also the variance of this term. So the coefficient found in this paper may conflict volatility effects with income shock. So I think probably you could use a maybe not contemporaneous price movement, but find a better way to control for the factor that introduced by this income shocks. So the paper used a correlated random effects model, which is nice because you could easily distinguish between the short-term or within country or long-term effects. But some of the tables in the papers actually do not control for the RVI bar here, which I found a little bit confused because I think you want to make the identification strategy and the methods coherent in this paper so that we could, for every result you're studying, you could have this short-term versus long-term decomposition. And for the IV, because it's a shift share RVI index, so you're using a shift share type instrument, which is nice because it uses predetermined export structure to assign exposure to a country. However, the global volatility shock would coincide with different stuff. And I think the exclusion restriction, you want to say more about why this would hold. If there are any concerns regarding the exclusion restriction, and especially because you are using this global financial crisis as a natural experiment. With I think even though it largely hits the commodity price in the international market, itself is not a natural experiment because there's a lot of macro factors that correlated with the financial crisis that could have affect the governance of this country through other channels, because of course the country's economy itself is largely shocked by such financial crisis outside of the resource sector. Okay, so you also see an export decline, a harder access to capitals or credit or whatever. These are the channels that are not related to resources themselves, but could also shape the governance outcomes. And yeah, so I won't say more about the models. And there's a minor point about the summary statistics. Is you show that the RVIT takes a negative value in table 1, which looks very hard to understand for me, because you are combining a shift share. The shift definitely gonna be a positive, and the share is also a positive because it's a standard deviation versus X for shares. So maybe you want to double check why there's a negative values there. And yes, so that's my discussion. Thank you.
Okay, so I think I'll start with the last one. Yes, I took note of that. I think it's data construction artifact, but yeah, it's 0.00 something, right? But yeah, thank you. But I think on volatility and revenue shock, you're absolutely right to push on that. The resource volatility index does conflate volatility with contemporaneous price movement. And so we should be more explicit with this in the paper. We have added resource revenue as controlling robustness check. I think you saw that in the paper. And the volatility effect persists, right? So it's, yeah, but now I think the other comment on beta 1 interpretation, that's fair. You've caught an inconsistency, but I think, again, if you look at those tables, we mentioned that all these controls were included, but for ease of presentation, they were dropped from the table. But I think it was an additional note. Maybe you missed that. On the IV exclusion restriction, I would say that is the hardest question. Again, this was a PhD seminar presentation by the student. And I'll be honest, the 2008-2009 period is problematic, I agree. Global financial stress almost certainly affected governance through channels beyond commodity volatility. But I think our defense is twofold. First, the IV result hold when we exclude 2008 to 2009, when we did the subsample analysis. Again, that is in the paper. But I guess where you were having an issue, you see one 2000 to 2010, 2011 to 2020. We did not show the result when you exclude 2008 to 2009, but it's right there. But we do not have an event study in terms of the DID to be able to take that into consideration. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, Musa. Thank you very much for this interesting paper. I think it's really nice to see works like this. I mean, so I guess I was really happy that you showed this table, I think, that splits the countries by income, right? Which sort of shows how the effects show the heterogeneity across a country. Why I said that, because, like at the beginning I was thinking, my sense is volatility of commodity prices may not really matter so much in a context where institutions are strong. And I think that is sort of where we circle back to at the end of the day, right? Because I take Nigeria as an example. Volatility, commodity prices are ex ante, you know that they are volatile, right? So a country should be prepared for that. There was a time, for example, Nigeria had the price of crude oil went up. The argument was do a lot of savings, right? But that didn't happen. Then you have the other bad part, and then the country started struggling. So, but in context where institutions are strong, you're just going to see that everything is smoothed. You see. So I guess my point is, I guess your paper sort of reinforce. So it's not really a question, it's more of a comment I'm making, that your paper sort of reinforce again the point that institution is central. So in a context where institutions are weak, you're going to see many things become problem for governance, including volatility. That is why they will want to share the cake on the table, because it's plenty. Let's quickly take it before it goes. But if institutions are strong, you can do that, right? So I guess my point is your paper is very interesting in the sense that it reinforces the role of institution. My take has always been that the key difference between developed and developing countries is institutions. And I guess this again came out very strongly. Just to say thank you for a very interesting paper. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.